Well, welcome to all the Sacramento Buddhist Church high school students. I don't know if it looks like it's mostly parents, but anyway, I'd like to welcome all the students, especially those who are aspiring to attend college in pursuit of expanding their education, understanding, and appreciation of life. Although college education may not be a prerequisite for everyone's situation, but for most, it would enable them to further and achieve goals and ambitions. Is a pathway that allows and enables you great opportunity and choice. Access or getting into college is not so simple. Today, we are fortunate to have a Sacramento Buddhist Church member, Jill Yoshikawa, who is the daughter of John and Elaine Yoshikawa. She's going to share with us the value of extracurricular activities, particularly community service when applying for college. And let's see, Jill is an educational consultant, and she has an education consulting business, Creative Marvels Consultancy. So with that short introduction, will you join me in Gasho? Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo
Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Amida.
Okay, with that, Jill, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Kuara and the Abba and the Betwin for sponsoring us today and having me here. It looks like from the chat that there are a variety of high school students represented from 9th grade all the way through juniors. No seniors? Are there any? Is there anyone who has a high school senior? Okay. So I'll talk more directly just about the admissions process and then more specifically about the extracurricular activities within the process. Just for my information too, is everyone's students at a public high school, or are they at any private high schools that are represented? If you don't want to speak if you could just send me a quick text message, that would be really helpful, just so that I can temper my comments accordingly. I'd like for everybody to be able to get what they need from this process today too. So if at any point you have questions, please feel free to jump in as I'm speaking, or send a text message. I'm monitoring it, but I know Stuart's also going to be looking at it and giving me a heads up too, so that we can make sure everybody gets their questions. Like Mr. Carrara said, I was a high school classroom teacher. So there aren't any interruptions in my life after you deal with 160 teenagers on a regular basis every day. So I'd rather you get your questions answered as we go today, rather than waiting for a Q&A at the end. So just to kind of talk a little bit about the overall process, extracurriculars are becoming a more important piece of the overall admissions process now that many schools are test optional. So for this year's admissions process for fall 2021, all 2/3 of all universities in the United States were test optional or test blind. So let me just explain what that means really quickly. So test optional means that students didn't have to submit SAT or ACT scores. And if they did, and the admissions officer believed that they were not useful to the admissions evaluation, then they were simply ignored. But test blind means that not only were students didn't have to submit test scores, but they also weren't going to be considered even if they were submitted. So there's a little bit of a nuanced difference. And so as families are looking at admissions policies for their kids, please pay attention to the difference between test blind and test optional, especially if your student doesn't feel confident in their test taking ability. That's something that's going to be really important. Now for fall 2021, all UCs, or excuse me, this coming fall 2022, so all the juniors in the house, none of you will be required to take the SAT or ACT. So all UCs will be test optional, and all CSUs, all 23 Cal State campuses will be what's called test blind. So again, so the second year in a row, so the CSUs, this is really upsetting the admissions process, because for Cal State universities, the entire metric is your GPA and your classes that you've taken in high school and test scores. That's it. That's the entire metric for Cal State admissions. So it's really turning CSU admissions upside down a bit. So that's something to consider, but it's also opening up a lot more opportunities for students to be admitted. So one other thing that I really wanted to address is, before we get into the details, is for us at Creative Marbles, and really this is how we have approached it because we're educators, is the admissions process is really about matchmaking. It's about the inherent aptitude of a student being matched with the right university, not a student having to chase an admissions, which is a very different way to look at admissions. Oftentimes clients will come to us and say, well, how do I get into, and then fill in the name of the blank school. We don't approach it that way, because then it's sort of like telling your son or daughter, like, you should change yourself in order to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a partner in life. That's just not the way that makes the sense for value either. So it's really about students understanding who they are, so that then they can select schools to apply to that will really help them further discover more about their aptitude. And then, of course, because you're paying tens of thousands of dollars for the investment in a college education, you really want to make sure that a student's going to get what they need and be able to understand more about themselves on the other end. Because the worst part to me would be for a student to graduate from, let's say, an Ivy League school, but have no idea of how to utilize that degree. It's kind of like having a Ferrari in your garage, but no driver's license. So it makes it really difficult. So I think if you can continue to think about the admissions process as matchmaking, and almost in this case, because, you know, all of you here today are parents, and so very few students, but it's almost like an arranged marriage, I guess, would be the best metaphor that we've come up with in 20 years doing this, because your parents are going to be involved in the transaction. Obviously, there's going to be, you know, the financial outlay. So I think it's really important to really keep thinking about, who is my student? And parents are the greatest resource for that, because you've literally been watching your children and, you know, pulling them out of your drapes and saying, no, don't eat that, since they've been very little. And so you know exactly who they are. Even if they don't always know, and as teenagers don't always listen to what you know about them, but you have that expertise. So it's really important for parents to stay involved in the process, which all of you obviously are, because you're here tonight giving up your evening. Are there any questions so far about the overall process, or about changing sort of your outlook on admissions? All right, well, I'll just keep going then.
Jill, I have a question.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm just like an interested bystander because I'm moderating today. But you know, I went through the whole thing with my kids and their whole application process. Well, and what you're saying is really interesting to me in terms of trying to understand the student and then pick the school. But if I just step back from that statement for a minute, it seems like an awful daunting task for a parent to know what schools are supposed to fit, or how do you go about trying to find, you know, that match, right? And I don't want to take you off on a tangent, but you know, you know what I mean?
It's a great question to ask. It's very valid, and you know, certainly one that we deal with every day. It really is about breaking down the school. So, for example, a lot of students want to find like-minded people, or what they call their tribe or their folks, right? So then think about, who is it that my kid hangs around with now? Are they equally adept at hanging around with the athletes as much as the band kids and the art kids? Do they have a diversity of people? Or is their social circle a little more narrow? Are they just all about the athletes that are around them? They're an athlete themselves. So then you want to start looking for those qualities and characteristics. Now, of course, you're thinking like, how do I figure out who goes to these schools? Well, this is where social media is actually really useful, right? It no longer becomes a distraction, but this is where your teenager's skill at managing social media will actually be really useful. So I know before we started, Stacy was mentioning like on Facebook, there are parent groups, there are incoming student groups, there's all kinds of information for students to get. And I know there's no teenager in the world who's actually on Facebook at the moment. It's because they haven't used it in about 15 years. But for them to create an account and to be able to utilize it, or even things like Instagram and Snapchat, which they do use in droves, those are really great places also. And then Reddit, I found Reddit really useful. Every university has a subreddit. And so you can join that subreddit, and kids are constantly posting what they're complaining about, what classes they're asking each other for advice, what professors to avoid. There's all kinds of information you can glean. And then because it's public, anyone can post, like, what do you hate about your school? What, you know, where do you find, you know, I'm interested in, I don't know, Minecraft, like, where do I join a Minecraft league or whatever it might be, and you can find it. So that's one way, but it really is going to start with who is my student. So if you break out a university into like the social part, academic wise, right? And then sort of most kids want to go to school and they all say, because I want to get a good paying job, right? And that's how we sort of think of university, is it's going to have this return on an investment as far as a financial outlay on the other end. Well, then look at their statistics. Where are kids being placed 6 months out of college? Are they in jobs? Did they find that on LinkedIn? Where are they transitioning? How many of them are in grad school? What are they doing afterwards? And you can find all that information. The alumni pages of universities are really great places to do that kind of networking. And again, on Facebook and LinkedIn, there are very prolific alumni pages. You can just join it. Like, I'm a part of I've only gone to 2 schools, but I'm a part of alumni groups all over the country because it's helpful for me as my job, but also to just sort of hear what people are talking about in their daily lives. And you can really get a lot of information that way. So, but it's going to require some investigation. And then this is, of course, where parents are like, okay, how do I get my teenager to do that? Because I can barely get them to do their homework before 11:30 when it's due on Turnitin at 11:59 p.m. But they'll do it. They just sort of do it on their own time frame. One question that's coming in is about testing coming back for the testing. And I would assume this means testing in terms of SATs or ACTs. Let me see. Can I respond directly? I can, can't I?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So let me see. Oh yeah, it's SATs or ACTs. Perfect. So for the current sophomores, current sophomores in the 2022-2023 school year, it's going to be hit or miss at this point. For the UCs, for sure, there will not be a test, SAT or ACT required. So the University of California has basically put a suspension on SATs and ACTs all the way through the current 8th graders. So everyone in high school right now, plus the 8th graders, are not going to be required to submit SAT or ACT scores. So this year's juniors, when they're applying in the fall, it'll be a test optional process. But the sophomores and freshmen currently in high school, it will be test blind for the UC. So yes and no. The CSUs, I don't know yet. They're going on a year-by-year basis as far as whether or not they're going to require SATs or ACTs. And then private universities, it's somewhat spotty at the moment. But some universities have, like some private schools, so let me give you a few examples locally. St. Mary's College in Moraga, they have permanently gone to a test optional admissions policy as of fall of 2021 for the current seniors. So everyone will now be on a test optional admissions for St. Mary's. All the Oregon public schools, so Oregon State, University of Oregon, those are all test optional, permanent. These are permanent changes for those schools. They just took advantage of everything going on with COVID. But I don't know for, the big name schools. The Ivy Leagues, all 8 Ivy Leagues and Stanford will also be test optional for fall 2022 admissions, affecting the juniors. But as far as sophomores, we're going to have to wait and see. So not to muddy up the waters here. But one thing to, because Mr. Kuhar asked me to really talk about extracurricular activities. What's happening in this test optional, test blind admissions is that the subjectivity in the admissions evaluations is only increasing, which is making everything more complicated. So this is where extracurriculars and particularly community service is really important. So just like we were talking about, a student should choose a university based on who they are. They should similarly choose extracurricular activities that are meaningful to them. So for example, with community service, if you're just a naturally charitable, generous person who wants to spend all of your time with like furry creatures or old people or little people or running around in the environment, cleaning up stuff, then you should. That's absolutely essential. 2 things about that community service really shows. It shows your dedication and your thought for others, right? The benefit of the whole, not just yourself. It also shows your willingness to want to work with other people to get a job done that's really meaningful. So I think that's really important. But at the same turn, if a student is more of an athlete, right? Like maybe they're a swimmer, then their community service can be within their interests. So maybe they are a lifeguard over the summer, or they give away free swim lessons at Park Terrace in the summertime with little kids, but it's still within what they're interested in. Well, that all matters. And for admissions officers, they're going to be starting to parse the nuances. This is the subjectivity. So in an extracurricular resume, the way that students talk about their experience is going to be just as important as having the experience. But what's important to remember is you don't just have to collect a bunch of stuff, but it should be meaningful. So this is where, for us at Creative Marbles, we really talk to families about different opportunities that, like a lot of students during this last 12 months when they've been at home and on virtual school, parents have been concerned that their kids' video game time has increased exponentially. Like they're spending all this time playing Minecraft or on League of Legends and on Discord servers. Well, one, it's been a way for them to socialize with their friends in ways that have been safe, right? Because we can't just let teenagers run willy-nilly out there. But at the same time, they're very adept. So some of my students have started learning how to run a server, or they're learning very complicated game theory, right? Because they're running a Minecraft server for them and their friends. They're custom designing mods for that Minecraft. Well, these are things that they can report in their admissions extracurricular resume, right? Like every parent's like, what? You can like talk about I play Minecraft, but absolutely. And so it doesn't have to be formal. If it's formal, great. Abba's sponsoring a crab feed and we need kids to pick up all the garbage. That's important. But at the same time, if it's something that they're just doing on their own initiative, that's equally important. So not that I'm going to give your kids a pass and encourage them to just play video games all the time, but let's look at the nuances of what they're doing with that time. Or if they're binge watching YouTube, what are they watching? A lot of students, when I talk to them about watching YouTube, they're trying to understand current events. They're watching news channels or alternative news sources. It's very fascinating to me to what they do. But we just see it as adults, like, oh, they're just distracted on YouTube, right? Well, yeah, I'm not going to say that they're not, because they're teenagers. They totally get distracted. But at the same time, the way that they're using it, the skill that they're using to navigate YouTube, those are things that can come out in a college essay. Those are extracurricular activities. Some of our students are using that information. They're like volunteering at the ACC or teaching their grandparents informally how to utilize all of that information, from older generations. So they're volunteering, but it might just be within their family or with their grandparents and, their grandparents' friends and their in their social circle. But that's all community service too. And so I think what we want to do as you're thinking about extracurricular activities is just broaden out what that means. And not just look at like, oh, well, for rebels or for the church or for Boy Scouts, because it doesn't have to have an organization to make it legit. Does that make sense? Are there questions about extracurricular activities or, the lack of extracurricular activities, especially in the last year, because we've been, more sequestered? It seems like kids haven't had a whole lot of opportunities. That's definitely been an issue we've heard from clients and families as well. So I would take stock and look at what your student has been doing for the last year. Is it video games? Are they learning to make a souffle? Have they started to take walks around the block? Are they, more involved at home? Are they helping out, I don't know, take out the garbage or whatever? Like, look at what they've been doing, and then we can take stock of that. Because admissions officers, there's a place in the application. They're called COVID essays, right? But it's basically like, okay, well, I was doing Science Olympiad for 10 years, and then all of a sudden it got cut off in March of 2020, and I haven't been able to compete since. Well, that's important. We want to talk about what they're not being able to do as much as it can be what they are doing. So there's a question about extracurricular activities can also be for family. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our students, especially because we've been sequestering, I'm hearing a lot more of my students like helping out their grandparents, go put away the groceries or do the grocery shopping because, grandma's got immunocompromised and so they're helping out. Absolutely, we can put that on there. Or, a lot of the older siblings then had to take on responsibility to help their younger siblings monitor the Zoom and, do their homework and things like that. Well, yeah, absolutely. Those are activities that we can talk about in an admissions application, or even in the COVID essay portion of it. So I think that's important to kind of take stock. But one thing I would recommend is that kids just open up a document and just start bullet pointing everything that they can remember that they've been doing. For the most part, extracurricular activities should go back to the 9th grade. But the exception is, okay, I've been playing basketball since I-Leagues. And so then they would report that they've been playing since they were 6 or 7 years old. Or they joined Girl Scouts when, I don't know, what is that called? That's not a brownie. It's something earlier than that. A daisy. It's a daisy. Yes, thank you. So if they're a daisy, right, you can tell the totality of their experience. But otherwise, it should go back to the 9th grade. But, if they won some poetry contests in the 5th grade, that's definitely something we can't say. But if it's an ongoing activity. Let's see, one other question. Are admissions essays prompt-based only? So there's 2 questions in there. So admissions essays definitely have a prompt, but what I would recommend, because they're autobiographical in nature, they're all about who am I, is instead of writing to the prompt, because that will automatically narrow a kid's focus. They will start thinking of all the experiences that they think are only attributable to that one prompt. And what'll happen is that they'll narrow who they are, is instead talk about who am I? Just start talking about themselves. We call it like brainstorming, just basically dumping whatever's in their brain about themselves. Then as they look at the prompts, look at the stories that they want to tell, and we'll backfill them into a prompt. Typically for us for our clients, we just write that way. And then when it comes time to submit, there's like 3 or 4 different prompts that each essay will fit. And then we just find the one that frames it the best, because it doesn't have to be exact. So college admissions essays aren't like an English essay where if you don't write exactly to the prompt, the teacher's going to start taking off points and you're going to get docked grades. An admissions officer kind of uses the prompt as a framework and then bounces off of it. And they're really looking for understanding of who the kid is. So let me give you some quick examples. So from this year's class alone, one of my students, he bowls. Like, I don't know, he's like 17 years old, but he's like this channeling his inner 70-year-old man. But he is such a great bowler. And then he could explain, and he's also an engineer. And so he would talk about the physics of watching the ball go down the lane. And he talked about understanding the materials and the different kinds of bowling balls and what he wanted to do. It was a brilliant essay. And it came out just like that. He's like, wait, I can write about bowling? I'm like, yeah, you can write about bowling. So that there are no topics that are off base. One year I had a student, he happened to be Chinese and he was a tennis player, but he needed specific tennis shoes. But his mom gave him a budget that was pretty small for the shoes. So then he went online and he started looking at all these different shoes, but the only ones he could find that fit him within the budget were literally hot pink, right? So he's an 8th grade Asian Chinese boy, literal bowl cut, like literal. And he's running around the tennis court wearing pink, hot pink tennis shoes. It was a brilliant essay. It was so much fun to read and to work with him to write it. But you know, for him, that was such a telling point because he revealed about his immigrant parents. He revealed his love of tennis. He revealed his ability to research. And, you know, he just graduated from Berkeley and he's working for some startup and living in a San Francisco walk-up and just loving life. He's a coder. But it really spoke to a lot of his skill. And I think that's a lot of the reason that he had the success he did in the admissions process. Even, you know, getting into a school like Berkeley, being an Asian student applying, an Asian male applying to engineering schools. So that's where I would say about the essay. Let me think. Okay, and then the other question that she was asking is how students can talk about extracurricular activities. So there's a couple different places. Certainly in the actual admissions essay, you can talk about it. But I would caution students when they're talking about their extracurricular activities. It's very easy to say, this is what I did. What an admissions officer wants to know, though, is why did you do it? Not just what. In the resume portion of an application, there's a place to tell what you did. The essay should tell the why. Then they're complementing each other and you're not repeating yourself, right? Because you only have so much room. And so let me give you a quick, so for the University of California, from admissions officers that I know and have known for over a decade, they're telling me that they spend on average to read an entire application for the University of California from start to finish in 7 minutes. I'll just let that sink in for a second. So 7 minutes to get through an entire application, including the essays and the transcripts and the test scores and everything else. So you have to make a very quick impression. And the University of California has 4 short answers that are 350 words apiece. So we're going to take a 17-year-old's life and reduce it to about 1,400 words. Well, that's going to require effort. And that requires time. And, you know, Stacy can talk to you about her experience watching Kayla go through hours and hours doing that. But, it's very important. And I think that in the end, it's always really useful because then you know more about yourself. So then wherever a kid lands, they have a sort of a GPS or a roadmap to follow about how they're going to utilize that university and their experiences. But as far as talking about extracurricular activities in your essays, always focus on the why, not just the what. But it's really easy to focus on the what. So give your teenager multiple drafts. You know, for us, our students will, for a 350-word essay, they'll spend, some students will go through 12 or 13 different drafts on that one essay before it's done. It's pretty thorough because for the UC too, all 4 of those essays have to interlock, right? They should be like different chapters of your life, again, so you're not repeating yourself. And that's pretty tricky to do. Because the other thing these 17-year-olds are doing in the fall of their senior year is navigating the fall of their senior year. We're not quite sure how that's going to look in fall of 2021 too. Will they be back on campus? Will be going back and forth between virtual and not virtual? It's creating a lot of additional complexity in the admissions process too. So I've been talking a lot. Are there other questions? Because obviously I could keep going, but. Mr. Carrara, is there more about the extracurriculars or something else that you are hoping that we can talk a little bit about in terms of the admissions process?
Well, we have our Abba Community Service Award. And that's kind of the thing that I wanted to address in some way or another, because I think that there's a value in describing, as you said, the why of the community service, and maybe even a discussion of the people that benefit from the service that's performed, and why that's of an interest to the person. And then that kind of community service, I think, has much greater value than, say, putting in hours of work, or say doing some fundraising for a nonprofit organization. I think rather where a person is really helping someone in need. So I think that there's a value in addressing need and the clients who are being served. And as you said, the why of the community service, or the why of extracurricular activity as well.
Yeah, I think those are really important, because what happens a lot is kids will have a really personal connection. So one of my students this year, she's a junior, but her mom passed away when at the beginning of her freshman year from brain cancer. So she just raised a bunch of money, but has been working with a local organization, and she's in Napa, and then ran a marathon as part of her fundraising efforts. But it was really driven by her own connection and the help that doctors had given to her family and the staff. And so she wanted to, and this organization itself, and supporting her and her family even now. So I think it's really important. And then for her, it's a really great way for her to talk about the impact, obviously, of that event in her life. But I think there's always a personal story. That's one thing that I found when kids talk about their service, right? Maybe it starts because, like, one of our students this year talked about, as a Girl Scout, and talked about, well, it was just sort of this thing you did as a Girl Scout, right? Mm-hmm. And at first she was sort of trying to earn badges, right? Because it was really beautiful and they were colorful and you could sort of strut with your badges at, meetings and whatever else, right? But after a while, she started to think, like, what else is there? And it really turned for her when she was working with another student on their gold project, right? She, the boys will talk about this too when they go and give service for an Eagle project, that they start to see a different impact, right? Like one of our students who was a Boy Scout did his Eagle project out at the Walnut Grove Buddhist Church, but saw the difference. Like, he really talked about the difference between the community at the Betsuin versus the community out at Walnut Grove, and how small it was and the differences, but that they were all part of the BCA. And he really started to see a bigger picture for him, even though he admitted, well, it was just driven out of my own self-interest, because I wanted to get my Eagle Scout, mostly because his dad was kept asking him to get his Eagle Scout, and he just wanted his dad to stop asking him. And he talked all about that, but then sort of the lessons he learned on the other end. So I think it's very important to talk about the why. There's one other question here about the UCs having the same admissions process. So there's one online application for the UCs, and then there's a page within that where you mark each one of the campuses that you're going to apply to. So as far as the same admissions process, yeah, it's a single application, but the way that they apply the admissions evaluation is going to be nuanced per school. So let me give you a quick example. So for example, UCLA this year took in 140,000 first-year applications. So I'll just say that again. 140,000 people wanted to be a UCLA Bruin this fall. Okay. Yes, it's a great school, but not 140,000 people are joining the Bruin family this fall. So their admit rate dropped pretty significantly. We'll watch the numbers. I'll know it, but obviously they just can't let in that many people. But UC Davis similarly was pushing 100,000 apps, right? So in our minds, UC Davis is like the go-to backup school of choice. Well, it's not. Almost 98,000 applications first year. These are just first year, not including transfers to Davis. So the way Davis looks at its applicant pool will be different than UCLA, because UCLA is already crowded. They're looking for different metrics. It's a different campus. So how they're going to, there's 14 comprehensive review points. How they apply those will look differently between UCLA and Davis, or Berkeley and Merced. So it's the same process, but it'll look a little different at each campus. But that also means that kids equally have an opportunity to be admitted to UCLA as they do at Davis. So it's not like if you get admitted to UCLA, they start calling all the other UCs and saying, don't let in Jill because she got into UCLA. You could equally get in at UCLA as much as at Davis, and you can have all choices. Does that make sense? Well, I would hope so.
Yeah.
Let's see. So then one other question here, is it better to apply the CSUs or UCs that you only want to attend rather than also applying to a backup school? In my opinion, absolutely. You really want this idea of a backup school. The way that we look at it is more so as a diversity of choices, but all that fit the student, right? This is going back to the matchmaking, right? Every year I encourage students to apply to Sac State because it's no brainer, right? But there are very few students that actually want to go to Sac State, right? And I get that, I grew up in Sacramento. My parents literally lived down the street from Sac State, and I applied to it because I applied to it for a backup, but I had no intention of actually going there. I was way too close to my family. But what you want to do is pick the schools that most fit the needs of what you want, right? So if you're a business student, like if you want to study business, yeah, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo has a great business program, but it may not be the best business program for what you want to study. Maybe Cal State Northridge, given that it's in LA. Like if you want to study business but be in the entertainment industry, there's no reason for you to go to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. But Northridge, adjacent to Burbank and Hollywood and has a great film school as well, would be a better choice, because then you're going to be adjacent to a bunch of internships, because universities serve the local community. That's like Sac State. Sac State has a great business program, but it serves the local needs of our region. They have really good ties with SMUD and Intel. It used to be Aerojet. There's lots of things that Sac State has rooted itself into, but it's just local. So it's about also the experience that your student wants to have. Hopefully they'll be able to go back onto campus next year, which is what most kids use college for, right? A coming of age. And, certainly that was my experience. I chose to go to UC San Diego because it was the furthest I could get from Sacramento, but still be in the state of California. And that was really important to me at the time. But I think, as far as backups, you don't want to look at universities as backups, because there's lots of things that can happen in the admissions evaluation process, as you're seeing this year, right? So I'm sure you all have those stories of so-and-so's niece's cousin's boyfriend's neighbor who had a 4.8 GPA and saved every starving child in the United States and, rescues dogs in his spare time and sleeps about 2 hours a night and didn't get into whatever school, right? It's better to think about universities as far as how do they align with me. Then no matter what will happen, whatever your choices are, it's not, you're just settling for your backup. You're going to the school that fits the right thing for you. So that's kind of how we look at it. There's another question. Are community service, part-time jobs, athletics, and school clubs weighted or evaluated differently? So no. If you're an athlete, that's fine. If you're not an athlete and you do other things, that you're not going to get disadvantaged because you didn't play a varsity sport or you don't play any sports. A part-time job is important. A lot of kids like to work. It's pretty unusual. So where it might have been more usual for our generation, it's pretty unusual for kids today to work a part-time job. But if they want to, then they should. And part-time jobs, that again has a large category. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're working at Starbucks or at Oto's or something like that. It could be that they're babysitting or they have a regular dog walking gig that they do for the old lady down the street. That's really important. But no, again, any activity that a kid chooses to do should be based on their interests. So if they want to work, great. If they don't want to work, that's great too. It's fine. They can spend their time elsewhere, because what university admissions officers are looking at, what are kids doing outside of school while maintaining their grades and their academic achievements. This has a second question in the box as well. In other words, how does the diversity of extracurricular help an applicant? So again, if your student has a diversity of interests, right? Like they're equally interested in robotics as they are in, helping old people, then they should do both. Here's the caveat to that though. The more selective the university, what we have seen experientially, and I cannot prove this because I don't have backdoors or anything like that into admissions offices, but the more pointed or focused a student is, then especially for selective universities, Stanford, the Ivy Leagues, Georgetown, USC, those kinds of schools, then the more a student can make an argument, right? So for example, every year I'll have a student come to me and say, I want to be an engineer. I want to be a computer engineering major, right? Because they think, okay, working an iPad means that I want to code, but they have no experience coding. Well, when I look at some of my other students, like one of my students is getting ready to graduate from Georgia Tech. He's literally been coding since the 5th grade. Like he just picked it up. It's just his aptitude. I mean, his dad's a coder too, and I introduced it to him, but he's literally just picked it up, and he was creating apps, and he had all kinds of things going for him before he even applied to university. Well, that's a much stronger application to say, I want to study this. Universities can more readily make that jump. But if you say, I've been an athlete and I did community service here, but now I want to code and I have no experience, it's a bigger gap. So if your kid is diverse, be diverse in their extracurriculars. If they're going to think about more selective schools, I would focus more so. But again, then that comes back to, is a highly selective university the best place for my student? Is it the right place? So I got caught up. I graduated, did my graduate work at Harvard, so I can talk to that end of it. Definitely got caught up in the reputation, and it's lovely to be able to say I went to Harvard and I graduated, right? And I like to joke that sometimes my mom will say, this is my daughter who went to Harvard. It's definitely got a lot of cachet to it, but I think it has to be the right place, because those can be really, really stressful places to be a part of that community as well, because you feel like you have to sort of keep up all the time. But for some students, they thrive in that kind of environment, but not everybody does. And this year in particular, every Ivy League, well, I would say 50% of them, so 4 out of the 8, they had historic record lows in their admit rates. So Harvard's a 425-year-old institution, and they reported a historic low in their admit rate. It was 3.4%. So that means 97% of the people went home, with a thank you for applying, but, we regret to inform you. Well, that's a lot of really qualified kids who aren't getting in, but I'm not sure exactly why all those kids were applying, because they also saw an almost 50% increase in the total number of applicants this year too. So it's kind of a long answer to your question. And then there's one more. Is there somewhere you can find out the school's ranking is in best for a certain major? So yeah, there's lots of ranking services. US News and World Report is one of the most famous ones because it's been out there the longest, but it's also the most manipulated as well. So one of the metrics for the US News and World Report is basically a school's rejection rate. So the number of students that they don't admit, it actually increases their ranking. So there's an incentive on the university's part to encourage more and more students to apply so that they can deny more of them, because then their rankings go up. So I would always take rankings with like a crystal ice cream size block of salt. And look a little harder. They're great places to sort of query and then start looking a little deeper at universities like we were talking about at the top of the conversation. But again, using the metric of your student as your guide to then look at those schools. Because in my experience, rankings, they're rankings. That's about it. And then after that, you want to look harder. Because the other thing is that rankings don't always translate into economic utility. So a lot of kids seek the more reputable school, thinking that if I get this brand name attached to my skill set, that I'm automatically going to get jobs. And we just haven't seen that happen. So especially in harder economic circumstances like what we're seeing right now. So a couple of my students just a quick story. One of my students is getting ready to graduate from UCLA. So I know I'm using UCLA a lot, but it's just coming to mind. So, but he is in computer science. He actually has a computational mathematics degree, brilliant mathematician, but can't find a software coding job. I know it seems really odd, but he's having a really hard time finding a job. So just because he went to UCLA, he's getting interviews, but he's not always getting the job. So it doesn't always just translate. Because again, you know, for him, I think his aptitude is more in mathematics, and I'm hoping he'll figure that out, but it doesn't translate exactly to what he's trying to apply for. So again, that's going to come back to what's most valuable for your student. And every year I meet one or two 22, 23-year-olds who has a college degree, but now doesn't know what to do with it. I've met two already this year, which is pretty early in the year for me to do it, but that aren't quite sure. And it's much harder. It's much more humbling at 23 to have a college degree and be living with your parents and not sure what you want to do. So I think it's something to think about. So that was kind of a long answer to the ranking as well. Are there other questions about the overall admissions process or something else? Because I don't, you know, I know we're about 45 minutes in, so I want to make sure we get enough information. Otherwise, there's a couple other issues that I could bring up. So one is this idea of this incredible disruption that all of your children are living through in terms of schooling, right? So grades are becoming a much more subjective metric. When you're watching students who have had to make the shift virtually, right? And every kid has done that in their own way, right? Like some kids, it's just been seamless, but other of our students, like even taking tests online has become you know, in some cases a gargantuan task, right? Because an online exam where the question will disappear within a time limit is very different than being able to flip back and forth between a test booklet during a 55-minute class period to then go back and correct your work or skip a question. And then when you get the information back in your brain, you can answer it later on in the test when maybe you're more relaxed. But kids aren't having that opportunity right now online. So some of our students are seeing their grades drop because the test is still a significant part of their grade, but being able to navigate online testing formats has been, you know, taking them some adjustment. So I would say for a lot of families is to start looking at your kids' transcripts. If you have seen some changes in their grades, one, don't freak out, right? I think, you know, parents like to get worried about an A- or an A or a B-, right? Because somehow in this generation, there are two grades, A's and failure, but that's not the case. You want to look at more of the nuances. And then again, this is something that students can bring up in their applications. Here's what happened for me. Here was my experience, because their transcript may not match what extraordinary lengths that they had to go through while being at home sequestered, you know, totally upside down in their education while their teachers were scrambling to figure out how to do everything online. I mean, they tried pretty desperately to take an entire classroom and shove it through a wire, you know, through the internet, and it wasn't effective in most cases. Yeah, because it wasn't effective in the classroom, and then they just tried to do it online, and it was really ineffective. So I think that's something to think about too. So not to get overly concerned if you've seen a dip in your kids' grades, those will be tempered by the admissions officers for sure. And then of course your students can give some greater explanation to that as well. Are there other questions about selection or about the test optional or going forward with COVID and the disruption to your kids' schooling?
So I'm sorry, you said, just to clarify, you said that, you said what about a student's dip in grade in high school? Well, during this time?
So did you notice that your performance maybe changed a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that colleges will have sympathy for the situation because it's not great sometimes.
Right. A lot of our students who are strong, like in science or mathematics, Particularly their science classes, they saw a dip because you don't have labs and kind of that experiential learning. So that will definitely be understood. For every college that you apply to as well, there's a school profile that goes out. So hopefully your counselors are explaining the transition that happened. What high school do you go to?
It's a engineering high school in Pocket.
Okay, so it's pretty small. That if you also can work with your counselors, especially for private universities who are going to write your letters of recommendation, then you can also encourage them to include that information so that they can temper it. Here's what he did. Here was his experience before, but this is what happened with our teaching staff, and this is what he did to overcompensate, right? Like to get a tutor or things like that. Though that'll be really useful for the admissions officer then to interpret your transcript in a greater context and with more accuracy. But absolutely across the country, they're understanding the nuances. But what's really important is what's happening in Northern California is not what's happening in LA, it's not what's happening in Atlanta. So for you to give the local context is going to be really important. There's a question here about CSUs solely based on GPAs. Yes and no. It's also based on the classes that students are taking that then make up the GPA. So if, for example, your student is, again, going to apply to engineering, I'll just use that as an example. What math classes, have they taken 4 years of math? Have they taken 4 years of science? Did they take some AP classes within that selection to then make up their GPAs? But right now it's pretty much classes and GPAs for the CSUs because test scores are not being considered for the CSUs right now.
Jill, I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, are your clients the students or the parents or both?
Both, absolutely. Both. Yeah. I like to use the line that I speak fluent parent as much as I speak fluent teenager. So we oftentimes are moderating conversations, but parents, because of their life experience and the wisdom earned from that, will have a different perspective. So we address their questions and then we can translate that to their teenager and equally address their concerns. But yeah, for us, the client is the entire family. Sometimes that means auntie and grandma too. Especially for those families that I know their parents and I know their grandparents. So
yeah.
Let's see. So another question is, are AP classes more important to take than, say, student government? That's an individual choice because at the same time, I would temper my comments about APs. You shouldn't just take APs because they're APs. Again, if your student is a math person, then they may want to take all the APs in that math. But if they're not suited for an English class, maybe they want to take some honors classes in this 9th and 10th grade, but by 11th and 12th grade, they're taking the regular English classes, but doubling up on a science or taking statistics and calculus. Again, we're trying to use the transcript to indicate to the university admissions officer, this is my student's aptitude. This is their ability. But they shouldn't just, because the other thing is, if you're not, so my brother is here and he's literally a math teacher and got all of the math DNA in our family. Like I have none of it. So for me to take an AP calculus class would have been like wrong. It just would have been wrong. But for my brother helping me with my pre-calculus homework when he was in 7th grade and I was in 12th grade, it just was nothing for him. So that's the thing, is you want to look at each individual person and then tailor their transcript. And then for high school students right now, there's so many opportunities. A lot of my students are dual enrolled, so they're taking classes at the community college. So some of my kids who are very advanced in mathematics, by 11th or 12th grade, when they're old enough, they've transitioned out because they've taken every math class at their high school and are now taking calculus 1 or linear algebra or I don't know, whatever else that like that's math that they start taking at the community college level. And they're actually earning units. And the wonderful thing about a community college course too is it acts like an AP class. So it's weighted in the GPA. So that's also a bonus for a lot of our students. And if they don't need the math units to graduate from high school, leave those classes on the community college transcript because then you can hold on to the units and transfer those into a university. If you take the community college units to count for high school graduation units, you've lost the college units for it. You just can't double dip. Does that make sense? So that's one thing. Let's see, how much do admissions look at classes signed up to take as a senior? So every senior's schedule is reported in their application. So it's important to continue to keep the rigor. So a lot of my seniors are like, I just want to take the English and government and econ and then take 4 classes of TA. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. So they need to have a similar amount of rigor. They don't want to see you slacking off. But again, this is where you could add community college courses. So an advanced science class or something that's not offered at your high school would be really useful. Let's see. So let's see, sign up to take AP classes versus regular college prep. Again, the AP versus regular college prep is then going to be based on your students' interests. I think that's really important. How do colleges look at college classes taken in high school? In many different ways. So one, for example, with one of my students, he was just like, I don't know, he's a math guy. And so by the 7th grade, he had literally finished AP Calculus BC. Like he just was one of those kids with that strong aptitude, had been discovered early and his parents really nurtured it. So by 8th grade, he had no other curriculum to take. So he had a private tutor and then he began taking classes at the community college as well. So for him, it was really an indicator of his aptitude. And I think that was really important. But again, in the GPA, college course is a weighted grade, and it'll show a little bit of extra initiative on a kid's part because they have to go through a different registration process and work with their school to be released to go take those classes. But it can indicate, you know, an advanced ability. Are there any other questions as we're sort of wrapping up here? Because I know we're pushing 7:30. So, if there are other questions, I'm happy to stay. I'm happy to talk to people individually or, on the chat. I can certainly put my email address in there. And, I'm happy to give a shameless plug for our blog, which is at creativemarbles.com. And you can find us there too. If you have other questions that you want to talk one-on-one, but if there's any other last questions before we wrap up, or, because I don't want to necessarily hold people if they don't need to be here. The bell's sort of ringing, if you will. I don't have a bell anymore as a teacher.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill.
Yeah.
That was great, tremendous. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.
I wanted to, oops.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to thank Jill and Stuart also for being the technical expert who enabled this production. And by the way, I understand that it will be recorded, so it will be available for you to look at your leisure. This was a production that was presented by Abba, and it was part of our, well, we have a program, we have a scholarship education fund that we've been trying to build. And this is part of the first of some of the programming that we're providing. This year, we also have the Abba Community Service Award, which is the scholarship. It's intended for high school seniors and college students. And it's an opportunity, if you are engaged in community service, it's an opportunity to have that service recognized. So with that, just one more thing. Jill, we've been fortunate to have her on. She's truly an expert. This is her field of, this is her business. And if you would like to learn more about how to help your students, or if you're a student yourself, but if you are a parent and if you would like to learn more about helping your student negotiate this process of getting into college, then you should look her up. Yeah, her business is Creative Marbles consultancy.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.